Is podcasting dead? Okay, let's talk about it. I've gotten more questions this week than I have in the last few years of, is podcasting going to still be around? What are the stats? Like, does it look good? Does it look bad? What is going on with podcasting? All sparked from some big podcasters like Jenna Kutcher pausing her show. Jenna Kutcher is probably the first podcast I listened to. It's probably the first podcast a lot of us have listened to. So it's very valid that this would shake up some concern because if a podcast that big is pausing, what does it say about the rest of the shows? So in this episode, I'm going to be sharing some actual data so you can make a decision for yourself because I have to say, podcasting is not dead, but it definitely is changing. Okay, so let's talk about it. Welcome back to Podcast Cafe. If you're a business owner or podcaster, this episode is definitely for you, so you can make a decision on if podcasting still makes sense for you and your business in 2026. Let's start with some context. So, as we all know, podcasting really exploded between 2020 and 2022. Felt like everyone and their mothers were starting a podcast. And in fact, that's actually when I started my business in 2020 with Espresso Podcast Production. I started my first podcast back in 2018, so a little bit before the big burst of podcasting, but 2020 was really like the year of podcasting. I'm sure we all remember that. A lot of people started for the reason of visibility in the very beginning, and then the second reason was because everyone else is doing it. They saw their competitors starting with the podcast, and they thought, well, if they're doing it, I probably should too. I don't want to fall behind. That was the main intention of starting the podcast, was visibility, or because everyone is doing it, so I need to as well. And now it's been 6 years, and people are burning out of their podcasting. Honestly, most podcasts haven't even made it this far. The stat is most podcasts don't make it past episode 10, with 90% of them not even hitting episode 20. Okay, that's like the real stats. That is telling, because if a podcast can make it past that, that's where it gets really interesting of it's not just doing it because everyone else is doing it's doing it because there's a strategy behind it. I know you guys have seen this where all of a sudden you see people start a podcast and then you just never hear anything else about it. That's what I'm talking about. Just like the slowly fading away, where even the podcast in 2020 when everyone and their mom was starting it, a lot of those are not around. I will say most of those are not around still today. That is why podcasters like Jenna Kutcher and Joe Rogan are so big, is because if most podcasts are not making it past 10 episodes, and Jenna Kutcher made it past 900 and Joe Rogan is in the thousands, of course they're more popular than everyone else because they have done more. They've gotten their name out there. They've built bigger brands because they put out more content. Most podcasts were never built to work in the long term. They were never built to grow. They were built because they thought that they should do it and there's no strategy behind it. But at the same time, global listen rates are growing. People are listening to fewer shows, while that is true, but they're sticking around with the shows that they love longer. That personal branding is more important than ever because people are listening to your podcast because they like you. Okay, that's really important to remember. Podcast listeners are actually getting a lot more intentional, and that's good news if you built your podcast with intention. Okay, that's when they're going to stay with you. So, like I said, when someone like Jenna Kutcher steps away from her podcast, it raises concerns of, is this still a valid marketing source? Do I still need to do this? Is this still working out? And what I have to say to that is Jenna Kutcher is probably stepping away from her podcast because it did what it needed to do. She's a household name. People know her. She's grown her brand. It's done, right? Her podcast did what she wanted it to do. It did what she set out for it to accomplish. And that's just a life cycle of marketing. Now she's going to be on to something else that I'm sure is going to crush it because she's going to put her all into it. And that's not a meaning that you should step away from your podcast. It's just a saying what she did amazing. And now she might not need it anymore. So what I need to tell you is that a podcast does not need to run forever to be successful. It just needs purpose behind it, which hers had. So in 2026, here's what I see working that's working for my clients, that's working for myself, that's working in the bigger podcast atmosphere is podcasts that are niche, which have a very specific audience. They're built well, the production's good, the content is good. That's what people are wanting. The content is good. That still works. And have a clear call to action because if you want your podcast to be profitable, of course you need a good call to action from it. Some of the most profitable podcasts that I work with don't have the biggest listen rates, but they monetize well because they're intentional. They have the right listeners because that's what they set out with. That's what they were looking for. So they have listeners who trust who they are, can't wait for the next episode, love learning from them, love the guests that they have on, can talk about it with their friends. They like the podcast because they like the host. That's where podcasting is going to shine in 2026. It's not about virality. It's really about the depth of the relationship you have with the listener, the depth of your podcast, the depth of you being able to share what you want to share on your podcast without it being surface level. I challenge you to think in a different way because instead of thinking, is podcasting dead or is it still worth doing a podcast in 2026 or is it too late to start? Ask yourself this, what is my podcast actually for? Is it meant to warm up leads? Is it meant to launch an offer, support your marketing, work as your sales, replace your discovery calls? What is the intention of your podcast actually? What's it for? Podcasting is very much alive. The global numbers are growing. Listeners are obsessed with podcasts still. That hasn't changed. Their habits have. And in a world full of so much AI, the pendulum has swung so far that content everywhere was just like AI written and not deep. It was very surface level. And the pendulum is swinging back because listeners now want deep relationships with the podcast host. They're tired of this surface level stuff. If your podcast isn't growing and you don't know why, think, what is the goal of the podcast and is my podcast supporting this? Does it have a strategy behind it? And if it doesn't, that doesn't mean to stop. That just means maybe to pause and change it up a little bit. That's what I help people with, is actually giving their podcast a purpose in the bigger view of their business. So podcasting is not dead. It really isn't. And podcasting in 2026 is definitely not about doing more. It's about doing it on purpose. If this episode has got you thinking about your podcast and if it's actually working, I want you to, right after this episode finishes, write out the sentence, my podcast exists to blank. And what is that blank? My podcast exists to blank. For instance, my podcast exists to educate on podcasting. And in return, it is a lead generation source for me, and I do get clients for my podcast. But my podcast exists for educating about podcasting. So what is yours for, and how does it connect back to your business? If you don't have an answer, that really is a good thing to know because that means you should pause, reflect, and then move forward with a plan. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you have any questions, come and connect with me on Instagram or via my website, espressopodcastproduction.com, and I will catch you in the next episode.